Today we are talking about the dark secret hidden in the Garden of Eden, and it's going to be a good one because everything you've been told about the Garden of Eden is not what you think. So we're going to really dive into this and see what it has to do with, there's actually a lot to unpack here. So we're just going to start because there's so much to talk about, and I usually can go on for a little while. So we're going to jump right into it, and I'm going to bring up right here this article called The Garden of Eden, an Evolutionary Tale. And there's going to be a lot of things to talk about here, having to do with consciousness, and having to do with Gnosticism, and having to do with just the ideas hidden in these types of stories in general. And so this article is by Bruce McCraw on medium.com. I've seen a couple articles by Bruce that look pretty good, so we may take a look at a couple. So Bruce is a professor who taught philosophy, religious studies, humanities, and mythologies. And he wrote a book called The Magical Universe. So if you enjoy this, hey, go check it out. I haven't read it, but he seems to write good articles. So, The Garden of Eden, an Evolutionary Tale, says, back when I used to teach mythology to my college students, I would teach a section on creation stories. One of the creation stories I taught was the Garden of Eden. One approach I took was to ask them if they thought the story was a fall or a step up for humanity. So traditionally, the Garden of Eden is taught as being a point where humanity fell. The first sin was that happened. You know, in Christianity, they call it the original sin. By the way, for those who don't know, or maybe are new to my channel, I grew up in a strict Christian household. I was Christian for many, many years. I stepped away from it. And, you know, I have RTS, religious trauma syndrome, which is a psychological issue that comes from being indoctrinated in religion, which has, you know, symptoms of PTSD and CPTSD. Anyway, that's a little besides the point, but some background on me and what I talk about here. So traditionally in Christianity, it's taught that the Garden of Eden is, you know, the story. God creates man and woman. The serpent tempts them with the tree of knowledge. They eat it. God gets very angry because he said not to do that. And they get banned from the Garden of Eden. So it's taught as a very negative thing, a very bad thing. But what if it was actually a good thing? What if it was actually a positive thing? And I've touched on this in another one of my videos, I think called The Real Story of the Garden of Eden or something like that. But we're going to break it down even more in this video. So in traditional Christianity, it's taught as a negative thing. It's very, 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 very bad. However, we're going to see that it's very different in this book. And in particular, I want to tell you about, for those who know my channel, we talk about Gnosticism a lot. Gnosticism is a version of Christianity that was banned by the church. So it's a form of Christianity. There are many, many Gnostic books. And particularly, there's a book called The Secret Book of John, which talks about the creation story, and it talks about Adam and Eve. And there's a lot of other books too, as well as like the Apocalypse of Adam, and the reality of the rulers, the hypostasis of the archons. A lot of Gnostic texts. I've read a lot of them. They're on playlists on my channel, so if you want to check those out, check out my playlists on Gnosticism, those different books that I mentioned, and I give breakdowns and interpretations of all of them. So in Gnosticism, for those who don't know, particularly Sethian Gnosticism associated with the Secret Book of John, the fall from the garden is actually portrayed as a good thing. Because in Sethian Gnosticism, God, the creator God, is known as Yaldabaoth, or the Demiurgos, or the blind god, or the rebel. And he's an evil being that actually traps humanity on Earth, and he traps humanity in the Garden of Eden. So in Sethian Gnosticism, the creator God is an evil being and not the true God. What the true God is a divine mind that they call the One, or the Great Invisible Spirit. And it's a realm of pure light known as the Pleroma, pure light or pure mind, the Pleroma. And Yaldabaoth is sort of because everything is mind, everything is light. And Yaldabaoth is sort of a dark thought, an evil thought, a shadow of the One. And this evil being, Yaldabaoth, creates the earth as a prison, and then creates bodies and takes pieces of light from the divine mind and traps them into bodies to be his slaves. So the story is that Adam and Eve are actually trapped divine beings, as we all are. We are all divine beings trapped in these prisons, these flesh material prisons. And if Adam and Eve, or any of us, were free, according to Sethian Gnosticism, we would be more powerful than Yaldabaoth, because we are part of the one mind, the great invisible spirit. So we would be more powerful than Yaldabaoth. So what Yaldabaoth wants to do is to put humanity into a state of forgetting. So according to Sethian Gnosticism, the Secret Book of John, he does this in a number of ways. One of them, putting humanity, putting these divine sparks into a material flesh prison and causing them to forget and, making them subject to death and forgetting. And furthermore, the reason for the separation of Adam and Eve as well is to try and split different aspects of one being, because in the apocalypse of Adam, Adam is talking about how Adam and Eve were originally one, but then they were split as Adam and Eve. And this is to further confuse humanity, have different pieces and different parts so that they'll never remember who they are. And in Sethian Gnosticism, the Garden of Eden is a prison. That's why the tree of knowledge is forbidden, because that's another way that humanity can start to remember who they are, by eating from the tree of knowledge. So in Sethian Gnosticism, it's actually Jesus Christ that tells humanity to eat from the tree of knowledge, and that this tree of knowledge will bestow upon them what is called epinoia, or purposeful thought, or you can think of it like imagination. And what this will do is allow humanity to become aware of their divinity and realize what they are. But that's not the main, we're going to look more at this, but I just want to give you kind of a background of different interpretations, right? So, because in traditional Christianity, of course, that's not true, right? The creator God is the good guy, and Adam and Eve are his creations, and the tree of knowledge being forbidden is kind of a test, right? It's like a test to see if they'll obey him or not. But do you see how, kind of weird and twisted that sort of is? Why would you do that? Why would you do that? And then, the serpent is usually associated with Lucifer, who says, if you eat from this, you will become as God. And because God told them they would die if they ate from the tree. But Lucifer says, no, you will become as God. And this is kind of metaphor for understanding who you are. Because Lucifer and Christ are both archetypes of the liberator. Lucifer, Christ, Prometheus, these are all archetypes of the liberator. That just that pattern, that idea of liberation. So in modern Christianity, Christ is looked at as this being that you need to worship and obey and bow to, and is God. However, what Christ in Gnosticism was looked at as being someone who's just delivering a message, saying that you are divine and you can become like me, as in you can also become divine. So it wasn't, a looking for any kind of fealty or submission, but rather a saying you can be like me, you can be divine. So the message of Christ was sort of the same message as the message of Lucifer as described in the Bible, in that you can be like God if you have epinoia, thinking, purposeful thinking, and realize what you are. And you can become that. You can become like us. You can become like God. You don't have to be trapped anymore. So, but there's a lot. Let's go, because I need to not go off on tangents so much, but it's not really a tangent. There's just a lot to talk about here. So this individual, what was his name? Bruce McGraw, saying that he asked his students if they thought that the Garden of Eden story was a fall or if it was a step up from humanity. And for most people, that's kind of shocking, because traditional Christianity, it's definitely a fall. It is the original sin for which all humans suffer. God curses humanity for this, and all the suffering in the world. The reason for hell and all the suffering that happens is traced back all the way to Eve eating from the apple and then giving it to Adam. That's known as the original sin. And it's taught in mainstream traditional Christianity, like the kind that I grew up in, is that even if you were perfect and never did any sin, you would still be tainted by the sin of Adam and Eve. Like, even if you were perfect, never did anything wrong, followed all the commandments, you were already inherently sinful and flawed and dirty and broken, and must have the forgiveness of Jesus because of what Adam and Eve did. And if you look in the New Testament, they even say that, it's very, very sexist that women must be quiet and they can't teach in church and they have to submit to their husbands, but that they can, and it says more or less that the reason for this is because woman ate from the tree and gave it to man, like as if it were her fault, which is just disgusting. But they can be saved through childbirth. Like if they have children, then this is sort of their atonement from eating from the apple and letting Adam eat from it. And so you see this very sexist theme, where Sethian Gnosticism is the complete opposite. There's a lot of really powerful feminine figures in Sethian Gnosticism, where Eve is celebrated because as being an essential part to humanity realizing that they're divine, because that was a good thing that she ate from the apple and gave some, had Adam eat from the apple as well. That's celebrated. And you have tons of themes of powerful Norea, who actually challenged God and defeated God and burned down Noah's Ark, and so many cool stories. Check out that on my playlist as well if you want to hear about the secret daughter of Eve called Norea. That's an awesome story. I believe it's in my playlist called The Reality of the Rulers. It's in that playlist, or the video itself is just called The Secret Daughter of Eve. So the common interpretation of the Garden of Eden story is that it was a fall for humanity, that they lost their place in paradise. However, literally, there was no fall. That notion came from Plato, who in his dialogue, the Phaedrus, talks of spirits in the non-material world, some of whom were filled with desire for physical pleasures, so fell into a body to fulfill it. Now, there were more, so oh man, there's so many things I want to say. I'm just going to do it, okay? Look, so from Plato talking about spirits in the non-material world, some of whom were filled with a desire for physical pleasure, so fell into a body to fulfill it. Now, something I want to say here, this is not necessarily a bad thing. And a lot of people talk about how, they want to just exit physical reality. They just want to, they never want to come back here. And that was the view of Sethian Gnosticism, that this was a horrible place, an evil creation, and that we have to leave and have to escape to go back to the realm of divine light. That's not our position. That's not my position. We have more of the position of the type of Gnosticism shown in the Gospel of Thomas. We're not Gnostics, by the way, but there's interesting things to learn in Gnosticism metaphorically. In the Gospel of Thomas, which is a Gnostic text, it's that the kingdom of heaven is all around you. It's just up to us to realize it and to create it and make it. So the world right now, yes, it's a very hellish place. There's all this sexism, homophobia, genderism, violence, all this stuff is terrible. But we can fix that and we can make it into a beautiful place. So imagine everyone who says, I just want to leave, I want to get out, I never want to come back. Imagine if this place were wonderful. You'd be like, oh yeah, I can't wait to come back. I can't wait to do this again, because it would be great. The only reason why people think it's terrible is because of the state of the world that it's in right now. It's kind of like, it doesn't have to be that way. Just like there can be a really shitty video game or a great video game. If you're forced to play a shitty video game, you're gonna be like, I never want to play that game again. But if it's a great video game, like, oh yeah, let's keep playing. So we can make this a great place. And so the idea that it's interesting that it talks of spirits in the non-material world, some of whom were filled with a desire for physical pleasure, so fell into a body to fulfill it. And that's not a negative thing. I know they're putting a negative connotation to it, but think about it. If you're part of, you exit material reality, well, guess what? There's a lot of great things to do in material reality. Material reality is where we can experience each other in our diversity and have great, meaningful experiences together. And it's just a different state of being. There are so many things and wonderful things that we can take part in being in a body. So it's not a bad thing. It's just another mode of existence that we can exist in. It's sort of like the difference between a video game and the code. You can exist as the code, and that's very interesting. You have a lot of knowledge and understanding. but you can also exist in the video game and actually take part in that physical experience, which can be fantastic. It's just the world is shitty right now. That's exactly why we want to change it. And how do we change it? We change it by raising awareness and raising consciousness, because humanity is in a terrible state because it's in a low state of awareness. It's in a survival mindset and a fractured, fragmented mindset. We need to move to a new phase, which is the phase of thriving and a planetary civilization, where we are all connected together. We know what we are, where we are, why we are here. And instead of fighting each other and hating the other and what is different, we instead celebrate our diversity, learn from each other, and build meaningful experiences and help each other self-actualize and increase the quality of life for every individual and the collective. So that's the phase of existence humanity needs to get to. And it's important. That's why I do what I do. That's what my channel is about spreading information to help people, to give people the tools so that they can get there. So there are more esoteric versions of Christianity that do resemble the Plato scenario, but that certainly isn't traditional Christianity. The more esoteric version of Christianity and Plato are based on the belief that this life here in the physical world is unpleasant at best and evil at worst, and is a punishment for sin. So here he's talking about Sethian Gnosticism, more or less. Though he says that it is a punishment for sin. Maybe he's talking about play, because in Sethian Gnosticism, it wasn't a punishment for sin that they were placed in the material world, but literally an evil being trapped them there. So I'm not sure what that's referring to. But anyways, yes, this is in general the idea of Gnosticism, that the physical world is unpleasant and it is evil, etc. Okay, so others don't agree. Sri Aurobindo, in his Life Divine, says God created the world as an expression of love for humanity. Ex-Catholic priest Matthew Fox called creation an original blessing, not an original sin. So putting that all aside, I'm very interested in viewing the traditional Christian version of the Garden of Eden not as a fall for humanity, but rather as a step up, making it an evolutionary tale. I will argue that God wanted humans out of the garden, as parents might want their adult children to eventually move out of the house and start their own lives. Okay, so this is this individual's take on it, and it's very interesting, and it's very similar to a video that I did called "The Real Story of the Garden of Eden," which is very, very similar to Gnosticism, but it's looked at as that basically the Garden of Eden represents a lower stage of consciousness, and eating from the tree of knowledge and exiting the garden is gaining self-awareness. Because when you eat from the tree of knowledge, you gain self-awareness, you exit that sphere of the Garden of Eden, and now you enter into like the great, the Garden of Eden is small in comparison to the whole world. And that's sort of like a small fraction of just basic instinctual awareness going to self-awareness. You go out of the garden. Now you're in a much bigger world, a much larger world, because in this analogy, a much bigger capacity of mind rather than a small capacity of mind. And then there are angels placed at the gates of the Garden of Eden, guarded by flaming swords. And this is... by the way, that's why in Masonry they use a flamberge blade for their swords, because it's a wavy sword and it represents the fire held by the angels, the fiery swords. Anyway, the reason why the angels guard the gates in this metaphorical way of looking at it as consciousness is because once you've stepped into a new frame of consciousness, you can never go back. You can't go back from self-awareness to an instinctual phase. Once you have a new phase of awareness, you can't go back to their original stage. And of course, there's a higher stage as well, what we talk about as hyper-awareness, and once you have hyper-awareness, you can't go back to simple self-awareness, just like you can't go from simple self-awareness back to instinctual sentience. So this is why, you can never go back there. And the reason why it's kind of like a garden is because when you're an instinctual animal, well, guess what? You're just kind of happy and going along. Like, look at dogs. They're just happy all the time. They're running around, chasing balls. They're wagging their tail. They're just pretty much always happy. Well, what happens when you have self-awareness? You have all this, you have a much more expansive consciousness, but now you have anxiety. Now you think about that stupid thing that you said 10 years ago while you're taking a shower and you just feel awful about it. You know, there's a lot of new difficulties arrive with self-awareness. You gain all these abilities, but there's a lot more difficulty. And this is why when you exit the Garden of Eden, which is sort of like this perfect world, you now are in a much more expansive space, but it's not as simple as the small Garden of Eden where you just walk around naked and eat fruit. You're now in a world where it's a lot more to it, a lot more complex. And that's this going into self-awareness is what this metaphor is. And so let's continue here. So basically what this guy wants to say is that God is all-knowing, and so that he knew that Adam and Eve would eat from the tree, and that it actually wasn't a test for humans, but wanted humanity to get out of the garden, and did it so that humanity would have free will, and that this was God's plan all along. That's essentially what his argument is, or how he's interpreting it. Now, you can interpret these stories all you want. They're stories, they're metaphors. So Orthodox Christianity interpreted one way, for example. The Sethian Gnostics interpreted a completely different way. You know, Orthodox Christianity, they looked at it and said, oh, this is a great God, a loving God. And the Sethian Gnostics looked at this and went, no, this is a God that just wants slaves and wants to torture humanity, and we have to overcome this and have knowledge and understanding of ourselves as divine. So you can see how you can look at two groups can look at one story and come up with different interpretations. So this individual is coming up with his own interpretation. And so according to his interpretation, God planned this all along. He wanted humanity to eat from it. He wanted them to have free will. And this was his whole plan all along. Now, you know, this is not how I would interpret the story, because God punished them very strongly for leaving the garden, and you know, just that's not the way I like to interpret it, because God is quite a terrible character in the Bible. He kills so many people, very sexist, constantly wants people to just worship him and make sacrifices to him, and he kills firstborn children and in Egypt, and accepts a virgin sacrifice in the story of Jephthah and Jephthah's daughter. It's just all a mess. So I personally don't like interpretations of seeing God as the good guy. Not for me. You know, I grew up in a strict Christian household, and so I know the stories very, very well, and he's not portrayed very well. However, you could interpret it the way this person does. And if in the future we want a healthy version of Christianity, something like this would need to be done, where in a healthy version of Christianity, none of this would be taken as literal. It would be known that it was a metaphor, and then to have all the hateful stuff like removed or disregarded. So in that case, for those who wanted to say be like enlightened Christians or whatnot, who interprets it as a metaphor, as a story. That's the problem with all the religions today. If all religions today were simply interpreted as metaphor and not literally true, we wouldn't have all the problems that we have. The problems that we have come from a misunderstanding of what we are, where we are, and why we are here, and taking these fables as true, and then killing each other because of it. That's awful. Now, we can still learn from these stories and have interesting interpretations and metaphors for them, but we don't need to take them literally. Just like the Greek gods in Greek mythology. No one worships Greek gods and thinks that they're real, but they're very interesting, and we can look at it and we can, learn from it. We can understand them as archetypes of the mind, standing for different aspects of ourselves. Same thing could be done here, and that's what humanity needs to do to get out of this fragmented mindset of it's my God and my nation and my family and my people versus all you foreigners and others and, weirdo. Like that's gross. We need to transcend that very primitive mindset and have a collective, inclusive, diverse mindset where we are all working together to create a new world and all the intolerance is not a part of that. We need to remove all intolerance so we can have a world with tolerance. Now, so religion has to be completely reinterpreted. And Hegel knew this. Hegel talked about religion as being a step in the evolution of reality, which he called Vorstellung, or picture thinking. Hegel talked about how this was a way humanity starts to understand existence through stories, but that after that, they'll start to come to understand reality through reason. And understanding reality through reason is very important. And that doesn't mean boring. People associate reason with being boring because they often don't understand what reason is. But reason includes everything within it. It includes intuition. It includes creativity. It includes art. The reason why reason gets such a bad rap is because atheist materialists have really hijacked the word, and atheistic materialists aren't rationalists. They are actually empiricists and materialists. So reason goes very, very well with idealism. So reason and idealism really go hand in hand, where reason is all about thought and mind, and idealism is the understanding that reality is a mental reality and that physical reality is just an expression of a mental reality. And then atheistic materialists are empiricists and materialists. They believe that, sense data is what tells us what is true, what we can touch, taste, smell, hear, feel, and that the reality is material, and so they're not rationalists, but people have a bad understanding of what reason is because they've kind of hijacked that word. They always say, we're about logic and reason. They're not actually. They're about empiricism, which empiricism and rationalism are actually opposed to one another. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there, is that we have to evolve to a new stage, where we understand reality for what it really is, but that doesn't mean some sort of boring, mechanistic, analytic, just emotionless world. No, that's gross. Why would we want it? That would be terrible. No one wants to live like that. It just means that we understand reality as it is without believing these metaphors as being true. We won't, imagine 100 years from now, or whatever, 200 years, 500 years from now, whatever, 500 years from now, someone stumbles upon the Matrix movie and they think that it's true, and then everyone is worshiping Neo and watching out for Agent Smith. Like, that's crazy, right? So same sort of thing that happens here. These can be interesting, we can learn from them, but they should not be taken as literally true. So this individual's interpretation is saying that, well, God planned this all along. He wanted Adam and Eve to escape, and this is just the way he did it. So Adam and Eve's level of awareness. So now we start to get into consciousness, and this is really good. So looking at Adam and Eve's level of consciousness, it appears that it was low. This was exhibited by their becoming aware of their nakedness only after they had eaten the fruit. If anyone's unfamiliar with the story, they didn't know they were naked, but after they ate the fruit, they realized, oh no, we're naked, we should put some clothes on. And one can understand this in terms of consciousness too, where I'm talking about this whole thing as being a metaphor, as like, you remember being in the Garden of Eden is just pure instinctual awareness, and then eating the fruit and leaving the garden is gaining self-awareness. So if you're a pure instinctual being, you don't know that you're naked. Like, dogs don't worry about the fact that they're flopping around all over the place. They don't go, oh man, I got to put some pants on before I go outside and take a shit. Obviously not. Dogs don't worry about that, but humans do. Humans go, oh wow, I got to put some clothes on, and this is sort of the metaphor of why in a frame of looking, this is a metaphor for consciousness, why in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve didn't realize they were naked until they ate from the fruit, epinoia, got purposeful thinking, became self-aware, and realized, oh wow, it's just something that self-awareness is required to understand this kind of thing. So while they weren't aware of themselves as separate objects, they did apparently have the ability to reason, as we witnessed above. This makes the Garden of Eden story closer to Plato's version of a fall. If they are in a non-material realm, they could reason despite lacking a physical body. That could explain the dichotomy. This doesn't change the thesis of this article. Whether we look at the Garden of Eden as an earthly or a heavenly paradise, this was not a fall for humanity, but a step up. So one thing that I'm unclear about, I don't know much about the person who wrote this. I don't know if the individual who wrote this, McGraw, is taking all the story of the Garden of Eden as being a metaphor, or if he's saying, well, this actually happened, but he's saying you don't really know. This is what it's really about. This didn't happen. Okay, just to be clear, this didn't happen. It is a metaphor, and one can understand this as a metaphor for evolving consciousness, as I've discussed in one of my videos, and also more or less what the Sethian Gnostics believed. So I have not read the entirety of this article. I usually scan these articles real quick and go, hey, this would be a great thing to do a video on, and then I read it live with you guys. So I don't know. I would hope that this person, since this person is a philosophy professor and everything, I would think this person doesn't believe that this actually happened and is taking it as a metaphor, but it's unclear from how it is written. So one can view this as human self-consciousness, maybe it will become clear, slowly evolving with the biting of the apple. This gave humanity a much greater awareness and understanding of themselves and their world. It reminds me of the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Enkidu lives in the forest with the animals and they treat him as one of them. Then, when Enkidu ventures into civilization and seemingly has sex with the town courtesan, he can't go back to nature. All the animals start to shy away from him, treating as an other. He no longer belongs with them. So I'm thinking that it's fairly certain that this person is viewing these things as a metaphor, since he's comparing them to other obvious stories. So good. That's good to hear. So, and this is also true. So you can see how these, just like Lucifer and Christ are the same archetype, but so is Prometheus. There's crossovers to different myths, and you can see this is a sort of myth that is of a similar metaphor, that you have this individual who lived with the animals and they treated him as one of the animals. That's this idea of being in an instinctual state of awareness. But then when Enkidu goes into civilization, and this being a metaphor from venturing out of the forest and entering into a wider world or a more expansive consciousness, he can't go back to the nature. All the animals don't treat him as an animal anymore, but as something different. So Jean Piaget's development stages of consciousness in children. Now this is cool when we get into psychology here. So this also brings to mind the research Jean Piaget has done tracing the stages in child developmental psychology. And I want to emphasize the importance of this here because I talk about one of the tools necessary to gain hyper-awareness is something known as concept networking. And concept networking is the ability to look at apparently disparate subjects, apparently disconnected subjects, and seeing how they connect all together. And this is a good example of this, because you're going to talk about in psychology Jean Piaget's developmental stages of consciousness in children and how it compares to the Bible story of Adam and Eve. See, most people would think that there's absolutely no connection there. But when you start to see how everything connects, then you start to understand how everything in reality is an interpretation or expression of one thing, which is how reality is. And this gets expressed through psychology, through religion, through stories, through art, through music, all through everything that you could possibly imagine. It's all an expression of one thing. Just like you have white light that goes through a prism, and then you see the visible light spectrum, the colors of the rainbow from that. It's all originating from one central source. So being able to see how everything connects together is extremely important for hyper-awareness. There's more to it as well, like metacognition and phenomenological experience. But that's a very important part. Now, I just want to note that, because a lot of times people ask me, well, what is concept networking? And I explain it, but sometimes showing examples is really good. So this is a good way to see it when you start seeing how things connect together. And so this also brings to mind the research of Jean Piaget has done in childhood developmental psychology. So his first stage is called the sensory motor stage, and here the infant has no awareness of themselves as separate from all the other physical objects around them. Piaget says this stage lasts for the first 1.5 to 2 years of a child's life. And what's really interesting too is that through human development, you can almost see different levels of consciousness develop. Because when a baby's, in what they call what Piaget calls the sensory motor stage, a baby behaves much more like an instinctual animal. A baby, doesn't really see itself as separate from the environment. It doesn't really understand, it's not really until a child develops, passes the mirror test, and the mirror test is when they put a red dot or something on the child's forehead. It's any color, it doesn't matter what color it is, just a dot on the child's forehead, and they put the kid in front of a mirror. If the kid just sits there and does nothing and laughs or whatever, then they're considered to not have passed the mirror test. But if they reach up to see themselves in the mirror and reach up to try and remove it, it's like, oh, that child recognized that the reflection was itself. So at this stage, the child is beginning to develop self-awareness, the understanding that it is separate from its environment. And see, and the mirror test is not a great test, but it's just kind of all we have at the moment. We should develop a much more accurate and much more sophisticated test. It's kind of a very primitive one, but that's what we have at the moment. So I'm not saying it's perfect by any means, but it's what we have right now. But you see how this stage is that first you're in this sort of more instinctual stage where you don't know that you're separate from the environment, that you sort of think that the environment and you are all kind of one connected thing. When you gain self-awareness, you realize, oh, I am an I am separate and distinct from all things. But then when you start, and that's what humanity is at right now, and that's why we have so much hatred of the other and people who are different, other nations, other countries, other races, other genders. That's why there's a lot of hatred. Because when you realize that you are separate, there's a lot of great things that come with that. You're able to do so many things with self-awareness that you couldn't, as you can plan for the future, you can reflect on the past to a sophisticated degree. You can build cities and structures and governments and societies and cultures, all that. But there's also a lot of bad things that come with this understanding that one is separate, because then you have a lot of hatred of what is other and what is different. So what humanity needs to do now is evolve to the level of hyper-awareness, which is a dialectical synthesis of the two previous stages, where you had the stages of instinctual awareness, which is I and everything are one, and then self-awareness, which is, oh, I am separate. Then hyper-awareness, which is I am separate, but also part of an interconnected system, and from that perspective, we are all one. We are one and many at the same time. We are one mind, one universal mind that has particularized itself into a vast multiplicity of perspectives, and now are experiencing each other through separate bodies. And so ultimately at base, we are all one and all connected, but we are also experiencing ourselves in our diversity. When humanity realizes that, all the violence and hatred and sexism and all that stuff melts away, because instead of being like, oh, what the fuck is wrong with that person? You go, oh, wow, I want to learn about you. I want to, tell me about how you see the world, because we're all different perspectives of one. That's the whole point. And so we want to build and establish that connection better and better as we learn and grow from each other. And that's why in that phase, we celebrate our diversity and celebrate the things that make us unique and begin to learn from each other and grow from each other and teach each other, because we realize that we're all one. So to hate and hurt each other would be as crazy as to take a hammer and strike your own hand, because your hand is just a part of the body, and we're all different perspectives of a unified reality. Going off again but these are important things to understand. And I think it's helpful to point out when it's occurring so that people can get a better idea of how to use these tools to reach a new level. So the second stage in the child's psychological development is called the pre-operational stage. And this begins between 15 and 24 months after birth of the child. At this stage, the child becomes aware of themselves as separate from other physical objects in the world. This sounds a lot like what happens to Adam and Eve after they bite the apple and realize that they're naked. So you can see that even the stages of development in a human child to a human adult kind of reflects humanity as like our evolution our evolution of consciousness through the human timeline, through the time that humanity has been evolving from instinctual awareness to self-awareness, kind of reflects the development of an individual human, kind of a microcosm of the macrocosm. But humanity has yet to reach that next stage yet. So you see how humanity as a whole is kind of stops at self-awareness. And then an individual human, as it develops from a baby and an adult, stops at self-awareness. Very, 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 very few people go farther than that. But as human beings begin to, hopefully they don't destroy themselves first. But if indeed we can accomplish what we want to accomplish, which is having humanity become hyper-aware through understanding this information, then, in an individual human life cycle, they won't stop at mere self-awareness. They'll go from, as a baby, instinctual awareness. As they get older, they'll develop self-awareness. And finally, they will develop hyper-awareness. And this will reflect humanity's evolutionary trajectory as a whole, as it went from instinctual awareness to self-awareness to hyper-awareness. So you see how it's sort of a microcosm of the macrocosm. Anyway, so at 15 to 24 months, the child is realizing that they're separate from other objects in the world. They can pass that mirror test. And this sounds a lot like what happens to Adam and Eve after they bite the apple. Some people would argue that humans had it made in paradise, and Adam and Eve's sin ruined it for everyone. At least that is the Christian interpretation. I spoke about that earlier. It very much is, and it's a terrible way of looking at things. Not good. So it is also why Christianity needs Jesus to die for our sins to lift that burden of sin from humanity. Yeah, and that's a terrible thing. Like I said, there's a lot of sexism as well, because women are looked at as inferior to men because Eve ate the apple first, and they have to give birth to kids to sort of atone for that. Not good. That's not very good. So that's why we need to understand these things as metaphors, so it doesn't result in damaging ideas like this. So Judaism and Islam don't believe that the original sin is passed on through the generations. Thus, they don't give Jesus the divine status that Christians do. All right. Okay, good. So definitely confirmation that this individual views it as a metaphor. Garden of Eden is a metaphor for evolving stages of consciousness. So the Garden of Eden story is a metaphor for growing up, or evolving, if you will. It is like older children eventually needing to leave home to make their way in the world. If they continued to stay home through their 20s and 30s and 40s and beyond, their individual growth would be stunted. In the same way, God put that tree in the middle of the garden because he not only knew that they would eat it, he wanted them to. He wanted them to disobey his commands because he needed them to begin to make their own decisions and take responsibility for their lives. Just as parents are proud of their children when they go out in the world and make something of themselves, so God also wants to be proud of his children when they go out in the world and fulfill their promise. Now, see, I think this individual is absolutely right in calling it a metaphor for evolving stages of consciousness, but I personally don't like assigning God as being this benevolent father and us our children. A lot of this needs to be reworked, because then you sort of have it still puts humanity as lesser than God. And we need to realize that we can become God. God is the ultimate stage of our evolution and development. So ideas like this are promising ways of reworking religions like Christianity so that they're not dangerous, so that they are explicitly understood as metaphor, and that they can be metaphors for things like psychology. So you could see how this could be helpful for some people. Some people don't particularly want to study psychology, but they can understand metaphors. And that's fine. They should study psychology, but some people just won't. It is what it is. So metaphors are very, very helpful for people. And as long as religion is taken as a metaphor, then it's okay. So when it's taken as literal is when you have problems and all the hate arises from it. Because again, I think the Matrix is a good example. The Matrix, you can look at it as a metaphor, as reality being an illusion, and you can wake up and realize there's a greater reality, but we're not going to start trying to bend spoons and worshiping Neo and watching out for agents and all that sort of stuff. You get what I'm saying. As long as one understands it's a metaphor, it can be a fun story. It can be a helpful metaphor, but not to be taken literal. And we want to make sure that the metaphor doesn't have dangerous things, and seeing God as seeing a gap between humanity and God is not good. You don't want to give your power away to something that is apparently separate from you. You want to step into that power. You want to access your power, not give it to some imaginary being. So that's important to understand. But this is a great, that being said, it's still a great step up from the traditional story. So this is the way forward, not back. That is why Adam and Eve had to leave the garden. Their existence there had become static and stultifying. So God kicked them out of the garden and put 2 angels with flaming swords at the entrance, forbidding them to return, showing that the way is forward into more misery and chaos, not back. So this is something humanity must keep in mind today. We always hear people moaning about the good old days when things were so much better. That may or may not be true, but we are where we are now, and like Adam and Eve, we can't retreat back. We have to go forward. This is where our growth lies. Nobody said it would be easy. And that's something to understand as well, is when I talk about how when you go to self-awareness, you have so many more options, but wow, there's also difficulties that come with that. Now that you're able to reflect and plan for the future and all these things, you can think about embarrassing things that you did, or worry about upcoming appointments or something of that nature. It comes with extra burdens with your extra capacity. So it's it is what it is. It's a new mode, a new existence of reality. It's like leveling up in a video game and going to harder dungeons to fight. It's metaphorically speaking, these are ways where we face greater challenges, but grow and evolve on the way. So humanity now needs to grow and evolve to a new level where we can create a much better world, and we can eliminate unnecessary suffering. Now, we'll also gain new abilities, and there will be new things to worry about, new challenges. But that's how life is. There's always going to be new challenges. There's always going to be new things to overcome. But just because there's new challenges and new things to overcome, that doesn't mean there has to be more suffering. You see, that's the difference. Is that right now, our challenges in the world have unnecessary suffering. Now, when we evolve, and humanity does rather, and establishes a planetary civilization, there'll be a lot of new challenges, but it doesn't have to have unnecessary suffering. It doesn't have to have things like hunger and racism and violence and all that sort of thing. All of these things are unnecessary. So it's kind of like playing a video game. If you play a video game that's a terrible game, that's not pleasant to play, it's not just challenging, it's unpleasant. But if you play a good video game, each level gets more challenging, but it's fun. That's what makes the game fun, is facing new challenges. So as we evolve, we will face new challenges, but we can eliminate unnecessary suffering, so it's a joy to do so. So that's what's important to understand, is we're creating a better world. And that doesn't mean there won't be challenges, but it'll be challenges that we're going to take together as, cooperative mode, rather than right now it's like deathmatch. It's not good. It's crazy. So we want to be cooperative. We want to have fun. We want to enjoy the world. We want to learn. We want to create. We want to gain knowledge and understanding and have expression and experiences. And we can do all that. And that way we will begin to enjoy the game of life, rather than the way that it is kind of like shittily programmed right now. There's lots of bugs and viruses. So why would God create a world with no pain, hardship, or problems? What would be the point of that? It sounds almost decadent. So I don't know if this guy actually believes in God or not. No, I believe God created this world for us to grow. So it seems like this person may believe that there is a creator God, which of course is not true. Okay. So I want to be very clear about that. There is no creator God. We are the absolute. We are the all. This is all a manifestation of us. We just don't know it yet. I mean, some of us do, but humanity as a whole doesn't know it yet. This is all us and what we have created. So, yeah, don't. That's not necessary. So sure, there's lots of pain and suffering, but that's the point. It's how we grow. We should welcome it all as a challenge. So this person is sort of conflating suffering and challenge. It doesn't have to. You don't have to suffer through a challenge. You can struggle. You see, there's a difference between suffering and struggle. When you play a video game and you want to beat the next level, you're not suffering. You wouldn't play if you suffered, you wouldn't play that video game. It would not be a pleasant experience. But you struggle. But it's a fun struggle. It's a challenging struggle. You're playing the game. It's fun, and your character falls in a pit. It's like, damn it! But then you play again, and it's fun. It's a fun struggle. It's not suffering. So, we don't have to have the unnecessary suffering that we have in the world today. We will have struggle and challenges, but we can celebrate it while we do so, and that is how we grow. So the first noble truth in Buddhism says that life is suffering, and so I want to be clear that I am not a Buddhist. We are not Buddhists. We do not agree that life is suffering. Life can contain suffering, but it is not simply suffering. So for the Buddhist, this is life, but the Buddha does not leave us hanging there. He also gives us a path out of suffering. We can overcome our suffering and attain enlightenment. Were Adam and Eve enlightened in the garden? I don't think so. We would never see great masters like Jesus, the Buddha, or Lao Tzu being drawn back into this world of suffering and sorrow. They are beyond that. See, I don't agree with this. Saying that, like, great minds would not localize on Earth to help humanity because they're beyond all that, that's not necessarily true. If you want it, it's about wanting to help. It's not this escaping from a hell and then just staying in it's a lot more complex than that is my point here. So now, of course, we can't say for sure that certain people specifically chose to localize here and teach humanity. We can't say that, but it is possible. And I'm just saying, from this perspective, who see, we would never see great masters like Jesus or the Buddha or Lao Tzu being drawn back into this world of suffering and sorrow. They are beyond that. See, that's not necessarily true. If you want to help the world, that's a possibility. That's one way of doing it. It's not the only way, but it's one way. So this way is not to retreat back to our simpler natures, but to move forward through our human nature. It's not an easy journey, as we all know. That is why the Buddhists believe we have many lifetimes to work through it all. And it is true that we have many lifetimes to work through it all. Up until the 4th century, there were sects in Christianity that also believed in reincarnation, like Gnosticisms. Gnostics, Sethian Gnostics believed in reincarnation because they believed that the Demiurgos Yaldabaoth would continuously trap souls into human bodies. It was when you realized that you were divine that you could finally escape and be liberated and achieve what was called gnosis. And gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge. But we are not escapists here. We aren't seeking to escape. We want to transform. Because we know that we are gods. We are the absolute. And a god isn't about retreating and escaping. It's about creating and transforming. We want to create a beautiful world and transform this world. This world isn't something to escape from. It's something to transform and create. And eventually, yes, we can transcend it. And this is the third phase of existence when, because right now we're going from survival to what we want to go to is the second phase of planetary civilization. And then we're going to get to a new third phase once we go through the phase of planetary civilization to planetary independence, where we can then create our own mental reality and not even have to rely on a planet. But that's something that we want to get to through what we're doing here. We're not here to just escape, because that defeats the whole purpose of what existence is all about. So anyway, it's not an easy journey, as we all know. Oh, so the reincarnation in Christianity ended when Christian canon was finally agreed upon in the 4th century. So that was at the Council of Nicaea. And they totally obliterated Gnosticism, because not just Gnosticism, but whatever they considered to be Christian heresy against Orthodox, when the bishops had the power of the Roman Empire behind them, the power of Constantine. They just burned all the books, executed people, banished people, and they basically decided what Christianity was. Before that, it was very, very up in the air as to what Christianity was, really. The reason why that we have the version of Christianity that we have today is because Constantine called the Council of Nicaea, and a bunch of bishops agreed that it was going to be this way, and then they pretty much killed anyone who disagreed with them, or burned their books, or banished them, or exiled them. So yeah. Anyway, so for all the above reasons, I believe the Garden of Eden story represents an evolutionary tale for humanity. So I love this. I think this is a great article. I love it. I didn't read all of it. So if you'd like to, definitely go check out Brian McGraw's article on medium.com. And he has a book. So if you like this sort of thing, go check out his book. What's it called? The Magic Universe? I haven't read it, so I can't say if it's good or not, but the Magical Universe. But he has some other articles that may be interesting to take a look at as well. Anyway, I think the thing to really understand here is that I really like how he's connecting it with developmental psychology, and he's looking at it as a metaphor for the evolution of consciousness. He seems to believe in an actual creator God. So, of course, I do not agree with this. Believing in an actual creator God is rationally impossible. But looking at it as a metaphor, particularly as consciousness, I think is fantastic. That was pretty much what the Sethian Gnostics were going for before they had a word for psychology. And what I've discussed in my couple of videos as well as being a metaphor, and a lot of esoteric people have taken this metaphor to mean different things in different ways. But this is a much more helpful way to take a look at the Garden of Eden and realize that all these Bible stories, all these stories, they're metaphors. That's what they are. They're not supposed to be taken literally. Well, I mean, the Christian church would say to take it literally, but if one wants to live a clear-headed, lucid life, one should not take them literally and realize that they are metaphors created by flawed humans a long time ago. So there's going to be a lot of stuff that's just off. Like there's a lot of hateful, sexist, homophobic, terrible things in these books. So they're metaphors. There's also a lot of terrible things in them because they were written by flawed humans for various reasons. And so it's important to understand that as we look at these. And just like as we look at Greek mythology, there's a lot of terrible things in Greek mythology. Zeus went around fucking everything. So there's a lot of bad things in these different myths and legends. But they are interesting to look at, and we can learn from them as metaphors. And if we get rid of all the things that are just awful, then we can do so. And that's a much more healthier way of approaching religion. And this way, going forward, if religions begin to do this, we can have a much more connected and united world where people can still read their books and whatnot, but interpret it as a metaphor only, and remove all the hateful garbage in it and realize, well, this is just out of date and not good at all. And that's how we can move forward. So I hope you understand or understood and got something from this story of the Garden of Eden, how it has to do with consciousness, and even talking more about just beyond self-awareness, but going to what we call hyper-awareness as well, and humanity's need to go to from this survival self-aware mindset to a planetary civilization, which entails hyper-awareness, the ability to create a civilization, a planetary civilization, rather than disconnected, competing units that want to destroy each other. That's not good. We need to evolve beyond that, reach this new level, reach this next level, and create a beautiful new world where we are celebrating our diversity and learning and growing together. So I hope you enjoyed that, my friends. If you like my videos, hey, actually push the like button and push the subscribe button. It helps. If you've ever felt like you've learned something or gotten something from my videos, consider supporting on Patreon. It helps out a lot. It's the best way to support my channel. It's how I'm able to do what I do my live streams, make my videos, write my books, have a roof over my head, all that. So if you enjoy my work, feel like you've learned something, consider supporting on Patreon. You get access to our weekly supporters only live streams and our hidden Discord server, the Citadel. I want to give a big shout out to everyone who does support on Patreon, especially Zach, Renaissance Fairy, Cassidy, Michael, Angela, Maria, Top of the World, Ethan, DB, Storm the Delta, and everyone else. Thank you so much. If you'd like to support, the link will pop up right over here.